So imagine your house has this massive crack in the foundation.
Right, like a total structural failure.
Exactly. The walls are bowing, the floor is slanted, the roof is literally leaking, and your solution to this collapse is to passionately debate whether the living room should be painted blue or red.
Right, and then you just vote for a new interior decorator.
Yes, that is exactly what a controversial new stack of political essays claims Americans are doing, every single election cycle. We treat a collapsing foundation like a simple decorating problem.
Which is such a striking diagnosis because the sources we're looking at today by William Brianis, including essays like America, A Path Forward and Islamic America, they argue that our society is just treating outward superficial symptoms.
Political and economic symptoms, right?
Exactly. Without addressing what is actually a metaphysical internal disease. They assert that if the foundation is rotten, participating in the decorating committee is just a massive distraction from the real work.
And the mission for our deep dive today is to really get into that real work. For you, the listener, we are not going to rehash the 24-hour news cycle today or, complain about Washington, D.C.
No, we're skipping all that.
Yeah, the focus today is exclusively on extracting the highly specific, practical, bottom-up solutions these sources propose. Because people want to know, how can everyday people actually save a nation in decline when the usual methods feel so completely broken?
Well, to get to those solutions, we first have to understand the author's critique of how we currently try to enact change. Because the texts divide our typical methods into three categories: top-down, lateral, and bottom-up.
Okay, let's unpack this. Top-down and lateral are the ones he essentially dismisses.
Yeah, completely. They're dismissed as either impossible or actively harmful, because top-down change means waiting for sweeping constitutional amendments, or, historically speaking, the outcomes of a civil or global war.
Which, waiting for an amendment requires a supermajority consensus that simply does not exist right now.
Not at all.
And relying on a war to fix your neighborhood is just a horrific prospect. So that leaves the second option, the lateral approach. And this is what almost everyone engages in, right?
Right. The lateral approach is voting harder, donating to campaigns, maybe running for local office within a major party.
So why does the author argue that working within the system is a failure? That's what we're all taught to do.
The argument is that the system itself is structurally compromised by outside influences. If you have a two-party machine that relies on, billions of dollars from corporate lobbying and international financial entities,
Yeah, massive.
then that machine is not designed to serve the individual voter. When you participate laterally, meaning you just vote along party lines hoping your team wins, you are validating and reinforcing a completely broken status quo.
So you're playing a game where the house always wins.
Exactly. And your participation simply legitimizes the casino.
Wow. Okay, so if top-down is impossible and lateral is a trap, what does the bottom-up alternative actually look like? In the house analogy, how do you pour a new foundation while the old one is still sitting right there?
Well, the bottom-up solution involves establishing semi-autonomous local communities. Communities that are grounded in shared faith and cultural heritage. The author actually looks at models like the Amish or certain Orthodox Jewish communities in America.
Really, that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, because these groups essentially self-govern their day-to-day affairs, they resolve their own internal disputes, and they maintain their own safety nets with very minimal reliance on the federal government.
But those groups are famously insular, though. They survive by physically separating themselves from mainstream society. Is the author suggesting everyone needs to buy a farm and just disconnect from the grid?
No, and that's the twist in this roadmap. The sources strongly argue against isolation. The goal is to build these resilient, morally grounded communities in areas where the general public can visibly witness the positive effects.
Oh, I see. So it's about being a visible alternative.
Right. It is about creating a functional alternative to the modern, isolated lifestyle. As these local, self-sufficient communities develop, they network with each other to build actual national political clout.
So they become a voting bloc.
Exactly. But a voting bloc that cannot be bought with standard partisan rhetoric because their basic needs are already met by their own community structure.
But practically speaking, how do you build that kind of unified foundation when the country feels so fractured? You look at the culture right now, people seem to be living in completely alternate realities based on what media they consume.
That's a great point. And what's fascinating here is that the author draws a direct comparison between our current cultural division and Aldous Huxley's novel, Brave New World.
Oh, wow. Brave New World.
Yeah. In that dystopian vision, the population is kept docile and controlled through endless superficial pleasures, drug-induced happiness, and extreme materialism.
Right. And anyone who rejects that artificial comfort in favor of traditional human values, family, and genuine emotion is labeled a savage.
Exactly. The author suggests modern America is facing a very similar divide. People are either blissfully sedated by endless consumption and partisan entertainment, or they are marginalized for wanting a return to basic human morality.
So to build a bottom-up community, you need an ideological anchor that kind of cuts through all that noise.
You do, and according to the texts, that anchor is a return to the foundational American motto, "In God We Trust," but importantly, not as a political slogan or a bumper sticker.
Right, it'd have to be a lived reality.
Yes, because if the solution is truly bottom-up, the absolute lowest level, the bedrock of that entire new foundation is the individual. Before you can worry about your community or your nation, you have to establish sovereignty over yourself.
And the author lays out a strict hierarchy for this, doesn't he?
He does. It's a hierarchy of concern for the individual. It goes God, family, community, and country in that exact order.
Which implies a massive shift in how we spend our energy. Instead of agonizing over a national election, the priority dictates you focus entirely on your own spiritual state and your immediate household first.
The logic is that moral order begins with divine accountability. If you believe you are accountable for your actions, that duty naturally extends to how you treat your spouse and children,
Right.
then how you treat your neighbors. And only then does it impact the broader society. To save the nation, individuals must stop pointing fingers at the failures of the justice system or the corruption in Washington and actually start diagnosing their own internal corruption.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the sources use a super powerful analogy for this internal diagnosis. They compare the human body to a literal kingdom to explain the mechanics of self-governance.
It is a brilliant mechanism for visualizing personal responsibility. So in this analogy, the heart is the king of the body.
Okay, the king.
The intellect serves as the chief advisor to the king. Your eyes and ears are the spies, constantly going out into the world and gathering information.
I love that imagery.
Yeah, and your tongue is the ministry of defense.
Yeah.
Your hands and feet are the police force taking action. And your stomach represents the marketplace, managing consumption.
So if we run with that, if the king, the heart, is corrupt, the entire physical kingdom basically falls into ruin.
Exactly.
If the advisor, the intellect, is fed garbage data by the eyes and ears, then the intellect gives terrible advice and the king makes destructive decisions.
And this is where the concept moves from abstract philosophy to a brutal reality check. Because think about it, if you spend 5 hours a day doom-scrolling outrage media or watching highly partisan news, your spies are feeding your intellect toxic, manipulated data.
Oh, man, yeah.
Your intellect then tells your heart that your neighbor is a mortal enemy. Your tongue goes on the offensive, spreading division. Your hands and feet take hostile action. You have entirely lost control of your own kingdom.
I can hear a skeptical listener thinking, though, that telling someone to just purify their heart or control their spies sounds a bit, I don't know, passive. Like offering thoughts and prayers instead of an actual action plan to fix inflation or crumbling infrastructure. Like, how does policing your own internal stomach marketplace save America?
Well, the text argues it is an intensely active process. The underlying mechanism here is that virtue is the necessary spring of popular government. A representative republic is merely a mirror of its citizens.
So we get what we reflect.
Right. If the people are addicted to debt, obsessed with instant gratification, and incapable of regulating their own impulses, they will inevitably elect leaders who reflect and exploit those exact traits. You cannot have a just, restrained government representing a corrupt, unrestrained populace.
So reclaiming your individual sovereignty means you stop outsourcing the job of the police force to the state because you're actually policing your own limbs.
Exactly. You take active responsibility for your own education, carefully curating the data your intellect receives. You police your stomach by refusing to participate in predatory economic practices.
What does that look like practically?
Maybe that means taking your money out of massive multinational banks and using a local credit union, or refusing to buy products from companies that rely on exploited labor. If you don't govern your own habits, you surrender your personal kingdom.
And when millions of people surrender their personal kingdoms, the national government naturally expands into a tyranny to manage a population that is no longer capable of governing itself.
You nailed it.
Okay, so once that internal kingdom is actually in order, the hierarchy of concern dictates that the responsibility expands outward. We move from the individual to the family and then to the community.
Right.
But practically speaking, the modern landscape makes community living incredibly difficult. The sources point out that transient modern life has dissolved real communities into mere hoods.
Yeah, a hood is a physical space where complete strangers happen to share geography, but they live in complete isolation from one another. The garage door goes up, the car pulls in, the door goes down.
Yeah, that's suburban life for a lot of people.
People do not know the names of the people living 50 feet away from them, let alone if those people are facing foreclosure, struggling with illness, or, just needing a hand.
So the author's solution is actively establishing what he calls a civic society. The goal is to transform the hood back into a neighborhood, a place where people are actively encouraging good behavior, discouraging destructive behavior, and genuinely checking in on each other.
Exactly.
But to govern the civic society, the author introduces a political philosophy called Islamic constitutionalism. So the author is saying that to be a good American, you should look at Islamic law.
Well, the texts are very clear to distinguish this from a theocracy. It is a framework for harmonization.
Because for someone who just relies on mainstream news, hearing that Islamic ideals could save American communities might sound like a massive contradiction. How does that philosophy practically operate on a Tuesday in a normal American suburb?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is directly dismantling the idea that these two value systems are incompatible by pointing to their shared mechanisms. Both fundamental American ideals and Islamic principles assert that human rights, the right to life, liberty, property, and intellect, are endowed by a creator.
Okay.
They are not privileges granted by a government, and because the government didn't grant them, the government cannot arbitrarily take them away. This shared belief mandates a limited government.
And both systems also demand absolute equality before the law, regardless of race, class, or political affiliation.
Furthermore, both advocate for a free market, but specifically one devoid of predatory capitalism on one end and state-controlled socialism on the other.
What's an example of predatory capitalism in this context?
Systems like usury charging exorbitant interest, which strips power from the working class and consolidates it in massive financial institutions. By rejecting those practices, a community keeps its wealth circulating locally.
But what does this actually look like in action? Like, how does Islamic constitutionalism replace something like a standard homeowners association?
Well, think about a standard HOA. It operates mostly on punitive rules, right? Issuing fines if your grass is half an inch too tall or your fence is the wrong color. It's essentially micro-tyranny.
Oh, absolutely.
The civic society model relies on the Islamic concept of mutual consultation, or a shura council, which perfectly mirrors a classic American town hall. Instead of a board looking for infractions to penalize, the community members pool their resources and knowledge.
Oh, I see.
So if a neighbor is laid off and their grass is getting long because their mower broke, the civic society doesn't find them. They consult, identify the root problem, and someone goes over and mows the lawn while others help network for a new job.
Wow. So the practical takeaway for the listener is to embrace religious pluralism based on shared moral actions. Whether you are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or unaffiliated, the mechanism of change is building local safety nets.
Exactly.
Because when you take care of the neighbor who lost their job, you completely remove the federal government from the equation. You aren't waiting for a stimulus check to save your neighborhood. You're doing it yourself.
Right. So we have built up from the purified individual kingdom to the resilient consultative neighborhood. Now we have to look at how these strong local communities interact with the massive national political machine, specifically the two-party system.
And this is where the sources bring in George Washington's farewell address, which is fascinating because Washington's warning about the spirit of party is chilling to read in our current climate.
No, it really is.
He warned that political factions inevitably lead to animosity, riots, and eventually despotism. His specific fear was that citizens would become so exhausted by the constant chaos and gridlock of rival factions that they would willingly surrender their individual liberties to a single faction leader who just promises to restore order.
And the author argues that Americans today are living out that exact nightmare. Voters operate on autopilot, casting ballots entirely based on party loyalty. They view the opposing party not as fellow citizens with different ideas, but as literal enemies of the state.
While, ironically, actual policy is dictated by international banking conglomerates and the military-industrial complex.
Yes. The sources specifically call out the Federal Reserve. It's a central focal point because it operates as an independent entity that manages massive amounts of U.S. debt and controls the currency supply.
Well, we're all distracted.
Exactly. While citizens are hyper-focused on fighting over cultural issues on social media, unelected financial entities dictate the value of their labor through inflation and interest rates. The two-party system keeps the public endlessly arguing over the interior decorating of the house, so they never notice that the foundation has been sold off to the bank.
So what does this all mean? The proposed solution is to adopt the mindset of an independent or unaffiliated citizen, someone who flat out refuses to be pigeonholed by a party apparatus.
Right.
But telling someone to ignore the two-party system is like telling a football player to ignore the referee and just play their own game while the Super Bowl is happening.
Yeah.
The system still governs the reality on the ground. How does a listener actually detach when the laws are still being written by those two parties?
This raises an important question because you detach by radically shrinking your sphere of political concern. The sources demand active critical thinking applied locally. The author reminds us that the states themselves are sovereign entities with their own constitutions.
So focusing inward again.
Yeah. The mechanism for detachment is taking the 6 original aims of the U.S. Constitution, justice, tranquility, defense, welfare, liberty, and union, and applying them strictly as local metrics.
So rather than caring about a politician's stance on some massive federal bill that will probably never pass, you evaluate your town council, your school board, and your mayor based on those 6 words.
Precisely. If you judge every local policy by whether it actually promotes justice and tranquility in your specific zip code, you break the autopilot. You stop cheering for a national political team and start holding local representatives accountable.
Which is so much more practical.
And most importantly, it changes how you view your community. The author states, "I have no enemy other than Satan." When you adopt that specific worldview, the neighbor across the street with a different political lawn sign is no longer an enemy to be defeated. They are a fellow citizen who might need help when a storm hits.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It takes all the toxic anger directed at the national stage, which leaves people feeling entirely helpless, and refocuses that energy locally, where a single person can actually make a tangible difference.
It really does.
So let's summarize the roadmap we've explored today, because it completely flips the script on how to save a nation. It does not start in Washington, D.C., and it doesn't require waiting for a charismatic politician to fix the system.
No, not at all.
The concrete work starts in your own personal kingdom. It means putting your intellect back in charge of your decisions, starving your eyes and ears of outrage media, and actively directing your economic choices away from predatory systems.
Right.
It means prioritizing the immediate needs of your family over the allure of national political activism. Then, it scales up. It means walking across the street, learning a neighbor's name, and turning an isolated hood into a civic society through mutual consultation and shared moral support. And finally, it means ripping off the blinders of the two-party system, evaluating local leaders strictly on the actual aims of the Constitution, and refusing to let a political machine dictate who you are allowed to care about.
It is a profound shift from demanding rights and services from a distant government to taking aggressive responsibility for your own sovereignty. And I want to leave you with a final thought to evaluate your own position in all of this.
Yeah, go ahead.
The sources note that the American government was uniquely designed to be the servant, not the master. It is bound by a constitution that is supposed to severely limit its reach into your daily life. But a servant only follows orders if the master is awake, present, and actively managing the estate.
Wow.
So if you consider yourself a sovereign individual endowed with unalienable rights by a creator, are you actually acting like a sovereign in your daily life? Or have you slowly outsourced your critical thinking to a political party, your moral compass to a screen, and the care of your neighborhood to the state?
That's the real question, isn't it? If the foundation is crumbling, you can't just expect someone else to come pour the concrete. You have to be the builder, starting from the inside out. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you take these insights, look at the state of your own kingdom, and start laying those new bricks today.